Welcome to Alas, Vine and Hitchens. I'm Sarah Vine.
And I'm Peter Hitchens.
And join us after the break for discussions on subjects COVID and Syria. Welcome to Alas, Vine and Hitchens. I'm Sarah Vine.
And I am Peter Hitchens.
So this week we thought we'd try something new. I've come up with a topic and Peter has come up with a topic. And we've only just seen each other's topics. We thought it was quite an exciting idea.
It's just an exciting idea.
It isn't it? But all ideas are exciting.
Particularly my topic.
Particularly your topic. But we're going to go with my topic first.
Yes.
Is that all right? So I'm going to read out my topic and then you can tell me why I'm wrong about everything again. In late March 2020, in the face of the COVID-19 virus, the UK went into a lockdown that would later upend political power in the country and, more importantly, how we functioned as a society. Some followed the rules, some broke them. But what impact did lockdown have and what hold does it still have over us? Peter, where did you spend lockdown?
I ignored it. I went as far as I could into work every day on my own personal train. And I would have nothing to do with it as far as was possible, because I thought it was an act of extraordinary folly and disproportion. I am
totally with you. Unfortunately, I was living at the time with my ex-husband, Michael Gove, who was really all for lockdown. But it's quite tricky.
So I remember him permitting me to have exercise. I thought, oh yeah.
I was surprised at the thing I would say about lockdown, I was surprised at how little pushback there was against it.
So was I.
It was extraordinary the way that everybody just capitulated. And I can remember, because the beginning of COVID, there were lots of conversations about what needed to be done, etc., etc. And I remember Boris Johnson was very clear. He said, this is awful, but what we should do is we should protect the vulnerable. So people with immune impairment and over a certain age, and everyone else should just go back doing their ordinary job. And I thought that seemed like a really sensible way of doing it. And you could put in place provisions to make sure that, they'd have food deliveries and all that kind of stuff. And then very quickly we went from that rather sort of sensible kind of decision to this crazy idea that everybody had to stay isolated in their homes. And I remember at the time just thinking and saying to Michael, this is just madness. But the problem was they had all this crazy modelling, which someone had done. I think it was Dom Cummings, actually. the dead hand.
There was a man called Ferguson who was from Imperial College who was blamed for a lot of it.
Exactly. And the problem was that you could see their point of view, which was that they were worried that they would end up being responsible for what the modelling was predicting, which was horrific. But it was just so strange that they would take that extreme prediction and not think about, well, okay, fine, but if you do that, then all these people are not going to go to school. All these people are not going to go to the doctor for other ailments. All these people, all the other things that are important that stop people from dying just stopped. And it was mad.
It's something about responsibility in societies in which the state is too powerful. There is this terrible thing which almost all politicians are confronted with at some point in their times in office, which is there is something going seriously wrong, a war, a hurricane, an outbreak of disease, whatever it might be, and the immortal, terrible cry goes up, something must be done. And there will then be somebody with a plan who says this is something, and the politicians, they say, okay, we'll do that. Because there is this desire to do something, and also this desire not to be the person who didn't do anything.
Exactly.
And that's what they're afraid of. And in societies where there's very little individual responsibility and a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of collective responsibility in a strong state, the fear, and also societies in which there are a lot of lawyers ready to sue you, the fear of being the person who didn't do something overpowers almost all other
I can understand that you're worried about having people's deaths not on your hands, because that would have been absurd, because it was a virus. It wasn't as though Boris Johnson was going around killing people. But I can understand that you didn't want the responsibility of more people dying than needed to. But it was a natural disaster. Well, it wasn't a natural disaster, as we later discovered. It was manufactured. But the point is that I think there is a moment in politics where most of the time in politics, you go around doing your business and you do the things that you need to do. Occasionally you realise just how serious the job is.
Yes, but also people had gone mad. I remember there was quite a good film called Military Wives, about a military wives choir, which came out the first week of when the disease was spreading, but nothing much had been done about it. And going with Mrs. Hitchens to a cinema in North Oxford, and it was a film where you would normally expect it at that time of the week for the cinema to be full. And there were 5 of us.
Yeah.
The whole place, and it was that point I realised that people had begun to take this
I remember
ridiculously seriously, and I couldn't. And it's partly to do with the life that I've lived and the risks that I've taken. I just find it very, very hard to get panicked in this way. But I saw other people were getting this. I also remember riding my bicycle on a cycle track through a park in Oxford, and somebody coming the other way, and them stepping out of my way by about 10 feet as I approached in case I gave them the disease. And I have to say I called out to them in a sinister whisper, "Virus!" Because I thought it was so ridiculous that they could imagine out there in the woods with the wind blowing that I could
anything could happen. You're completely right about people going back, because I had a terrible incident in Waitrose, of course, with a woman over a tomato, and because I had approached the tomato, and I'm one of those people who likes to pick up a tomato and smell it to see if it's a nice tomato, because I know about tomatoes. I don't want to buy a horrible flowery tomato. So I picked up this tomato, smelled it, decided it wasn't very nice, and then put it back. And she went ballistic at me. Yes. "You can't put that tomato back." So it's a COVID tomato.
You could be killing
standing there thinking, you're completely insane. You can't catch COVID from a tomato. And anyway, I don't have COVID. So it was just that level of insanity. Yeah. So I had sort of both sides. I could see both sides of the debate, because I was watching Michael having these Zoom calls with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and them discussing the latest horrendous statistics that had been sort of, presented. And I also remember when Boris actually got the disease and was genuinely quite ill. And I remember that night where people were saying, we were being told that he might not pass the night. So it was quite frightening in parts.
That was an extraordinary moment, because it did bring it home. I think people like me who were opposed to the shutdown were constantly accused of believing that it had no dangers, and I never felt that. It was obvious that this was a disease which could, under certain circumstances, kill. I never doubted that for a moment, but I still thought the reaction was overdone.
Completely overdone. My mother was one of the first people to catch it, actually, because she lived in Turin at the time, and Turin had the first really bad wave, northern Italy. You probably may remember this. Yeah. The reason for that being is that they have a lot of Chinese textile workers who come over and work in the north of Italy, because that's where a lot of the textile factories still exist, and so that's why the contamination was so early.
Don't a lot of Italian families also still live multi-generationally?
And yes, exactly. A lot of Italian families are multi-generational. So there were a lot of children who were asymptomatic who had it, or adults who were asymptomatic who had it, who were giving it to older relatives, which is why their death toll was so bad. And in fact, the kind of numbers that were coming out of northern Italy were very influential in the decision ultimately to lock down. But I remember my mother having it and being very ill with it. But she would have been 73 or 4 at the time. She had it for 2 weeks and then she got better. So I was sort of, it's a nasty disease, but if my mother can survive it, and she's absolutely in the category who is supposedly very vulnerable to it, I didn't think that it would necessarily have, in those early days, I couldn't understand what they were saying about the predictions.
It was an illustration to me of what it must have been like, for instance, in 1914, when the whole of Europe went crazy over war, that once an idea takes hold in people's minds, there's no amount of reason that can shift it. It made me realise for the first time what it must have been like in Europe in 1914, when there was mass hysteria about war. And in England, ducks and dogs were being kicked to death because they were German-owned shops having stones put through the windows. And this level of feeling completely untouchable by facts or logic. And I was disappointed, because I had thought there was a deep prejudice in favour of liberty in the English people, but if there ever was such a thing, it didn't show itself. The willing acceptance of orders to do everything. And I used to just take the mickey out of it. On one occasion, I got hold of an old Polish war surplus gas mask and put it on and rode through Hyde Park on my bicycle with it. And thinking that I would have the sort of same impact. Was it Marcel Duchamp who walked through the Luxembourg Gardens with a lobster on a lead? I thought people would laugh, but it was just taken as completely normal. I was just doing what everybody else was doing, and slightly more so. It didn't. You couldn't mock it. You couldn't argue against it. And the really extraordinary thing is when it came up again on the 5th anniversary, and I put a few photographs of some of the mad restrictions that I kept a sort of library of them on Twitter. The response I got from quite a lot of people was still, don't you realise that your stupid attitude killed people?
You didn't kill anyone.
I don't think that I killed anyone, and I wouldn't have done it if I thought that I was doing so. But that's what an awful lot of people still think 5 years later, which is, in a way, why my heart sinks when we discuss it again. It was a complete failure of reason.
You're completely right. And the other thing that I would say is that I always wondered, when I was reading my history, how it was that neighbours could have shopped their neighbours to the Nazis or just betrayed their family members. And I realised during COVID that people will and can do that sort of thing. They will do almost anything to save their skin if they think their skin is in trouble.
And to settle scores.
And so there was a lot of people who were reported for breaking rules who weren't really breaking rules, or who just got confused about the rules, because the rules were very confusing. I mean, I was living with somebody who was making the rules and I didn't really always understand them because they seemed to change every 5 minutes. I had a terrible thing during COVID, which was that there was a sort of slightly complicated moment where we thought my daughter had it, and because Michael was in the cabinet, he was given a test to see if he had it, to see whether or not he should self-isolate. And at the time, the tests were very hard to come by, so there was a sort of test hysteria going on. We didn't test Beatrice, but we tested Michael. Michael didn't have it.
This is because Beatrice wasn't in the cabinet.
Beatrice wasn't in the cabinet, no, so she wasn't allowed to test.
She couldn't have a test.
Exactly.
Even though
she was in her bedroom.
Actually have had it.
She was locked in her bedroom, being fed through a small slot in the door. But Michael, who was in the cabinet, had to have a test in order to see whether he could be cabinety or whatever it's called. And he didn't have the COVID, so that was fine. So then he went for a jog the next morning, and a member of the public spotted him doing this and took a snap and sent it to, as it happens, my own newspaper, the Daily Mail, saying, look here's Michael Gove having a jog even though he's supposed to have COVID. This is awful, blah, blah. Anyway, the editor of the Daily Mail at the time rang Michael up and said, I've got this picture of you having a jog with COVID. What do you have to say about it? And he said, no, I don't have COVID. We did a test, blah, etc. They ran the story anyway, which was lovely. And my daughter, who at the time was sort of 15 or 14 and had a sort of social media account, was attacked online by hordes of raging people who were sort of threatening to kill her and rape her and do all sorts of terrible things because she was an awful person, and she'd taken a test away from someone who should have had a test, and it wasn't. And it was just madness. It was completely insane. And I remember, just as a mother, you feel terrible when this sort of thing happens to your child, but it was just also, it was everyone in my life at that stage had gone mad because of COVID.
There was a time when some poor soul either died of COVID or did away with himself. I can't now remember which, but he did die. And he'd once retweeted something I'd said about COVID and the reaction. And people were lining up on social media to denounce me for more or less having killed him.
Yeah. It's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary.
It was like because it was all electronic, they could do no harm. But in spirit, it was like the Red Guards in Peking in the 1960s, hurling elderly professors off rooftops. If they could have done, if they could have hurled me off a rooftop, I think they would have done. But
I agree.
They couldn't find me, so that wasn't available.
And so there was that aspect of just the sort of insanity of it all, but also the lack of what I would term, wider thinking on the subject, which was that it was obvious that if you did this lockdown, that it would be catastrophic for the economy. I mean, I never understood, and I wrote about this on several occasions and got shouted at a lot, I never understood why schools weren't considered to be essential services. To me, a school is an essential service.
Well, they were to begin with, and then they started closing them.
Yeah, exactly, because all the teachers were upset and worried that they were going to get COVID. But most teachers are 22. If they do get COVID, it's probably not going to affect them.
I mean, a lot of people were using categories which would have been appropriate for a severe flu outbreak. The only previous thing like this was, I think, the Asian flu outbreak in the 50s. I think it was quite similar, quite a lot. It was on the same level. The transmission of that and the effects of it affect young people of school age quite strongly, whereas COVID, by its nature, just generally didn't do so. But people had lost all contact with logic by then. It was all about politics. And this was a fascinating contrast with Sweden, where through a constitutional quirk, if the Swedish politicians had been able to do what the British government did, they would have done it. But by constitutional quirk, their scientific chief had complete freedom from the interference and could do what he liked, so they didn't do it. And that was
why they didn't lock down.
Something similar happened in Japan, where the MacArthur Constitution simply prevented any Japanese government from having that much power. So they couldn't do it. The Japanese, in any case, behave without being told, so in such a restrained and disciplined manner that it didn't probably make all that much difference. But they didn't take the same sort of compulsory measures that a lot of countries did.
But there seemed to just be a sort of weird delight in lockdown. Do you not think?
Yes, I'm absolutely sure quite a lot of people were enjoying. People do enjoy a crisis.
Do they? I don't.
They do. Well, we're very lucky. We live in an industry which is constantly exciting and entertaining.
Constantly in crisis.
And exhilarating.
As we're used to,
Indeed, as you say, in crisis. But that's what we have. We have that wonderful stimulus of interest in our lives. Although for a lot of people, life is extremely dull, and a crisis is a change. And so again, when I talked to particularly my mother, not so much my father, because he had been at sea a lot. My mother was on the home front during the Second World War, and she was quite clear that in a lot of ways it was the most enjoyable time of her life, because there was a constant air of
well, it's
crisis
interesting
and drama.
You say that.
I think there's an element of that in it. Putting up the blackout curtains and the strips on the windows and doing the rationing and all the rest of it is a kind of, first of all, you have an enormous feeling of doing something in common with other people, which people also like doing. I quite understood all that. Doesn't make it think it was a mistake any of
the thing I couldn't stand was all the sort of clapping for carers.
That I would not do.
I found that excruciating.
But it was nice. The people.
It was just virtue signaling.
Everybody in my street was doing it.
Yeah.
An awful lot of people in my street work for the NHS anyway, but they were very tolerant of us for not joining in. No one ever spoke and said, we were going to join in, which I thought was rather sweet. There was never any of that.
Well, I mean,
I think I was just a local eccentric.
We didn't have any choice because we got shouted at if we didn't do it. But what I would say, you said earlier that your mother said that it was one of the best times for it. My son remembers lockdown as being sort of the halcyon days, because he was 14. He didn't have to go to school. He got to do everything online. He could go to the park, for an hour's walk and have a nice time. I mean, he loved lockdown, absolutely loved it. But that's because he was at that age, but also a relatively happy child. And even though Michael and I were our relationship was falling apart, but he was still living in a nice house with nice people. But there were lots of children who were trapped in their houses or their flats with horrible people who had no access to any help or anything. If you think of Arthur Labrigno Hughes, that poor little boy who was filmed in his sitting room saying nobody loves me. I mean, that child had his entire support system removed from him.
Students had their lives completely ruined, I think. The whole experience of university was denied to them, and I think an awful lot of people have been permanently
a lot of
damaged
people
by that, because it's irreparable. The years are eaten by the locust. You never get them back.
And also those are crucial years in a child's life. I mean, I think it damaged both of my children in different ways. But I mean, a lot of their school friends started sort of taking drugs and smoking weed because they were so bored. And I know anecdotally that it was bonanza time for the drug dealers in London. Because they had all this sort of captive audience who were just sitting at home.
They could zip about the place and nobody was going to stop them.
Exactly. But it was so bad for our society as an idea, as a concept.
Yeah, there were many things which were obviously bad, and I think there were people in the government. I don't think all politicians are stupid. They're not. That's not the problem with them. But there were people in the government who were intelligent and informed and knew some history, who yet allowed themselves to be swept into this. Well,
I was very surprised at Michael, because I always thought of Michael as sort of very kind of libertarian fundamentally. And he was quite draconian.
I would have put him on the other side if you'd asked me in advance which way.
Exactly. And I was really confused by it, because he's always been a very free thinker. But I think he was just very flummoxed by those numbers. They were very scary.
Anybody in that government could feel the power flowing into their fingertips from the people. Well, that's what it does, because you distill power out of fear. That's the fundamental basis of all power, is fear, and people want you to stand between them and danger.
Yeah, and I think he was also they were just all very, very worried that a lot of people were going to die. But anyway, just to wrap it up, do you think the incredibly, £400 million, the COVID inquiry is going to cost the taxpayer? Do you think it's going to do it? Do you think it's serving its purpose?
No. I could tell you in advance what conclusion it will come to. I'm just not interested in it.
What is the conclusion?
Oh, that we didn't lock down hard enough or fast enough. That's what they will eventually say.
And
I hate the term lockdown, by the way.
It's awful.
From an American prison term.
It sounds like a rap song. Do you think that if it happens again, which is not impossible and not inconceivable, do you think they'll try the same thing again?
It'll be in a different shape, just as the Iraq War has arrived in a different shape in the Russian War. It'll look different, but it will be fundamentally the same. And yes, I think people will fall for it in just exactly the same.
So you're not hanging up your face mask just yet?
It won't be that. It'll be something else. It won't be that, but there will be the same acceptance of stupidity and folly.
After the break, join us for Peter's topic.
Welcome back. We're here to discuss issues of great moment. I am Peter Hitchens.
I am Sarah Vine.
And this is my chosen subject, which is, why do we keep messing around in other people's countries when we can't sort out our own? We can't even fix the potholes. We can't teach children to read. There aren't enough dentists, and yet we constantly rain missiles, bombs, and send soldiers to countries all over the world which we think we can fix. What gives us this idea? This particularly comes to mind this week with the news from Syria, which, thanks to Western intervention, has been turned from a pretty hideous but more or less stable tyranny into a screaming bowl of fire and pain by Western intervention. And the regime which we recently welcomed, all the television channels and all the radio channels saying how wonderful it was, a subsidiary of Al-Qaeda, has now turned out to be just exactly as nasty as anybody could have thought it would be. And people are being killed because of their ethnicity and their religion, just as anyone would have predicted such a regime would do. Why did we do it? And people, by and large, don't even know that we did it. If I say to you, Sarah, the words timber sycamore, do they mean anything to you?
No.
No. But nonetheless...
What do they mean?
Well, the Central Intelligence Agency, the principal organ of intelligence and foreign interference in the United States, set up an operation called Timber Sycamore, and they spent $1 billion, $1,000 million on this, which is entirely designed to destabilize and eventually overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad, the then president, and indeed a hideous dictator who murders his own people and all that kind of thing.
Mate of Putin.
He was once a guest at Buckingham Palace, I should point out, for tea. So he's a mate of whoever will have him. But that's neither here nor there in this. The Syria at that time was, for its inhabitants, although it was extremely repressive and you couldn't say anything and there were horrible prisons and torture, it was a relatively stable place where you had a house and a job and an economy and money came into your bank account and you could spend it. It was turned by the subsequent war into a mass of ruins, which it remains, and hundreds of thousands of perfectly normal people were turned into corpses and millions of them into refugees by this operation. And for what? We now have another different kind of despotism at the end of it. And do we actually disapprove of despotism and dictatorship? And I would just like to mention here a couple of things which people should bear in mind here. One, we remain on extremely good terms with the regime in Saudi Arabia. Our royal family go there regularly. Our political leaders go there and bow before the princes to have medals placed around their necks. There are pictures of this going on. This is a country which, when it had a major dissident in the form of Jamal Khashoggi, enticed him into their consulate in Istanbul, where they murdered him and cut him up with bone saws before transporting the remains back to Saudi Arabia. And down the road is Egypt, where, having had a spasm of support for Arab democracy in the Arab Spring, remember that? Well, the Egyptians, being offered democracy, then elected a government headed by the Muslim Brotherhood, which was disagreeable to all kinds of people, so there was a military coup. And the elected government of Egypt was overthrown by the army. And the army then massacred hundreds of people in the streets of Cairo to make sure they didn't put up any resistance to this. And this regime is entirely endorsed by the West. So if we really, really disliked Bashar al-Assad because of his repression and his killing of his own people. Why don't we turn the same guns on Egypt and Saudi Arabia? Because that's not our real concern. These interventions,
what is our real concern?
Are they about?
But I mean, didn't we do the same in Libya with Gaddafi?
Oh, Libya. Well, again, this is completely baffling. There was supposed to be a threatened massacre, but the parliamentary committee which looked into this said there was no actual evidence that any such massacre was happening. On the basis of this, we overthrew Gaddafi. Now, Gaddafi was, again, a terrible man. But
no, absolutely, no question of that. But he was at least in control.
Replaced by complete murderous chaos. And the other thing about Gaddafi, and like him or not, was that he undoubtedly controlled the coast of North Africa and prevented an enormous amount of migration across the Mediterranean since he fell.
Well, I mean, since
the Mediterranean has been like the Channel.
Since he was removed, Italy has been completely swamped with illegal immigration.
And not just Italy. I mean, they move on from Italy. It's one of the two. The Syria war had some part in this, but the Iraq war even more, and the Afghan war too. An enormous, one of the biggest migrations in human history from the Middle East into Europe has been caused by these wars we constantly start, these wars of intervention we start to make life better, supposedly, in places where life isn't better, while we completely neglect making life better in our own countries.
I agree with you on that front. But also Afghanistan, which the Americans pulled out of so ignominiously and is now, again, overrun by the Taliban.
Well, it's even worse than that. If you look at, have you ever seen a film called Charlie Wilson's War?
Yes, I have.
It's one of the cleverest films ever made, and it's about the
Charlie Wilson, not the old editor of the Times.
No, not that Charlie. This is
just
an American congressman who had the brilliant idea when the Americans were trying to get the Soviets, as they then were, out of Afghanistan, of arming and equipping people who we would now call jihadist Muslim fanatics, but whom we then called the Mujahideen and heroic Afghan fighters, giving them sophisticated Western weapons so that they could destroy the Soviets, which they did. The problem was that they then decided they'd carry on. Yeah. And it was probably the foundation of September the 11th and everything that followed, and of the weaponizing of the Taliban, and this folly of intervention. And there's a brilliant bit at the end where the guru is being asked about whether the result of this action will be good. He says, "We'll see." And this is always will these things have good outcomes? We'll see. But almost always the answer is no, they don't have good outcomes. No. Why is it that Western politicians are so, I will actually say obsessed, it's a word I try to avoid, obsessed with this form of action?
But also, as you say, it's illogical and slightly random, because if you were going to do this to Assad and if you were going to do this to Gaddafi, why wouldn't you do it to Saudi Arabia?
Well, there is a logic in it, but they're not telling us what it is.
It must be money, surely.
No, I don't think so. I think it's utopian ideology.
Where do we look to for the clues? Is it the United Nations? There must be someone who's making these decisions.
No, there is in the United States, there has been really since, in some ways since the Second World War, a sort of messianic desire to make the world a better place.
Right.
And we have to be glad about that.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Well,
that's a good idea.
There is something wrong with it because it so often fails.
Yes, but it's a good
people get it
principle
into their heads that everything's the Second World War over again. The person they're trying to overthrow is always Hitler. They're always Franklin Roosevelt. They're always afterwards going to be able to set up a better society.
Right.
It's utopianism. It's a desire to make the world a better place. There's nothing wrong with it as a desire, but the difficulty is in actually making it happen. The world is much more complicated than that. If you look at a lot of this stuff in recent years, it has been to please Saudi Arabia, precisely the nastiest regime probably in the world.
Okay.
The hostilities.
So why have they got this hold?
Well, because they're so rich.
Okay, so it is just the money.
You go by the connection between the United States and Saudi Arabia since Franklin Roosevelt went, soon before he died, to this great meeting aboard an American destroyer, I think the Quincy, in Great Bitter Lakes and Suez Canal. He had this meeting, and they actually put Turkish carpets and camels on the decks of the ship so that
camels?
Ibn Saud could feel at home while they had the meeting. And Roosevelt really
camels travel well on
Roosevelt
ships?
really buttered them up. Churchill a few months later tried to do the same thing, but Churchill would insist on smoking and drinking, which Ibn Saud did not like. No. And it didn't go down half as well. And the Saudis chose America as their great friend.
How do these interventions benefit the Saudis?
Well, here we get into the awful algebra of the Middle East, but the Assad regime was not a Sunni Muslim regime that the Saudis were happy with. Assad is a member of a very curious sect called the Alawites, who are sort of Shia Muslims, but not even really that. It's quite complex. But as a result, he played off different groups against each other in Syria and was very friendly, for instance, with the Christian minority, who will now suffer.
Who are now suffering.
Because he's gone.
Yeah.
But he was also quite pally with the Iranians, who are Shias, and who can't stand the Saudis, and who the Saudis can't stand. And that was really what Syria was about. The Saudis wanted the Assad regime over and done with in Syria because it was an ally of Iran. Apparently, a lot of the desire behind the 2003 invasion of Iraq was to reduce Iranian influence over Iraq.
Yeah.
It backfired completely. There's more Iranian influence in Iraq now than ever there was before.
But to go back to your original question, which is why are we so obsessed with foreign intervention when we can't even get our own house in order, do you think that's just a throwback to colonialism?
It's partly that. I think it's also partly television. Foreign interventions are always shown on television at the easy start.
The BBC likes a foreign intervention.
Well, the BBC love a foreign intervention, and the other, but also it looks good. There you are. You have missiles being launched everywhere, and then you have these videos taken from jets of the bombs landing, which show an explosion. It doesn't. The films of war in the Middle East don't show you that. They show you the corpses and the.
But do you think that's changing now?
After the bomb goes off, but we just see a kind of sort of fairground thing where we fire a missile and boom, look, there's a split.
But I think that's changing now, and I think that's one of the reasons why Trump is so determined to sort of pull out of this situation with Russia and Ukraine, because I think social media has changed all of that. Because now on social media, you will see videos of people being hacked to death, and which would never be on the news before. So you wouldn't actually see the reality on the ground of this, of these diplomatic decisions, of political diplomatic decisions. Whereas now, I mean, I've seen videos of people being dragged through the streets, but it's awful stuff. And I think maybe you're right. Maybe the public didn't quite realise the extent of the repercussions of these things.
When it's proposed that this country gets involved in the Ukraine war, there's enthusiasm for it. And an awful lot of conservative, I use the word with its capital C, an awful lot of conservative politicians and conservative media figures have now come round to seeing a good side of Sir Keir Starmer, because he's become a warrior prime minister. Do
you think that's just displacement activity, though? They can't actually fix the potholes, the schools, the hospitals, the prisons, but they can sort of make grand pronouncements about something that's happening a long way away.
Except that they can fix them. I mean, none of these things is insoluble. If you look into all of these problems, you can see where their origins are, and it's not just money that's necessary to fix them. It's determination. To some extent, it's agreement, particularly with the health service. It would be agreement among the major parties that there should be a sustained period of reform to make the British health service more like the French one, in my view, which would have to transcend political boundaries and carry on even for general election, intervene. You'd need that. You couldn't solve, but you could greatly increase the suppression of crime, again, if you cooperated on a program to do so. These things are not difficult to do. You could improve the schools, which nobody has succeeded in doing since 1965, if you wanted to, but they're not interested in thinking about any of that. And the rapid rewards in terms of popularity of foreign posturing, and also the enjoyment of it, instead of sitting in some ghastly windowless committee room underneath Downing Street, you're on a plane to somewhere sunny where people treat you as if you were important. And it's foreign mania.
Camels and Turkish rugs,
Foreign mania. And in the case of Sir Keir Starmer, it's early onset foreign mania.
That's very good. But if you flipped it on your head and imagined that, I don't know, Assad had decided to interfere in British domestic politics, we'd be completely outraged, wouldn't we?
Well, we would, but generally people like that don't, because it's not much in their interests to do so.
Do you think the world needs people like Assad and Gaddafi? Are they the lesser of two evils? I'm not saying they're not evil, but are they just the lesser of two evils?
No, I think we could have managed imperial withdrawal a lot better than we did, and then found ourselves with better people and better forms of government in the countries we, having in many cases raped, we then deserted. I'm not defending them. I think they're horrible. The difficulty is not in being critical of them. The difficulty is in doing things which would actually replace them with somebody better rather than somebody worse or just as bad. And there's very little thought. An awful lot of the American congressmen and senators who supported the 2003 Iraq war, and an awful lot of British MPs, did not know the difference between a Shia Muslim and a Sunni Muslim. And how you could embark on a war in Iraq without knowing that difference exists and that it is important.
I wouldn't have known that back
It's
then.
Unbelievable. It's like building a navy without knowing that water is wet.
Well, that's, I'm afraid, all we've got time for. Let us know your thoughts on both of those subjects. alas@mailonline.co.uk. You can leave a comment on Spotify or send us a voice note on WhatsApp 07796 657 512. Start your message with the word alas. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.
Look forward to it.